I whisper words, you come to me. The song I sing for all to see. The past is gone and now I know. Inside this cell, nowhere to go.
When people think of the 60s and the 70s, they usually think of hippies, Nixon, and the Vietnam War. But what many people do not think of is Charles Manson. Charles Manson lived a life of crime during his entire life and left behind a legacy that lives on infamously in American history. But what exactly did Charles Manson do? Charles Manson did a lot of things. Heavy drugs, mainly focused around psychedelics, car thefts, physical assaults, armed robberies, led a cult, and prophesized his own teachings, and even orchestrated murders. In this video, we will deep dive into the life and legacy of Charles Manson. Charles Manson was born Charles Miles Maddox on November 12, 1934, to a then 15-year-old Ada Kathleen Maddox in Ashland, Kentucky. Charles's father is believed to be Colonel Walker Henderson Scott. Colonel Scott was not an actual military officer. He had a reputation as a con artist and rather let Ada believe that he was a high-ranking military officer. Colonel was his actual given government name. Once Ada let Colonel know that she was expecting, Colonel bailed on her, claiming that he was summoned on military duty to leave the country for an extended period of time. Over time, Ada eventually realized that Colonel had abandoned her, and as a result, Charles never knew his biological father. In August 1934, Ada married a man named William Eugene Manson, who worked as a laborer at a dry cleaning business. Ada would often go on drinking sprees with her brother, Luther Albert Maddox, leaving Charles with babysitters. Ada eventually divorced William in 1937 after 3 years of marriage. Charles was born during their marriage, so his surname from birth was changed to Charles Manson, which is the name that is widely known. William claimed that Ada was guilty of a gross neglect of motherly duty. 2 years after the divorce, Ada and her brother Luther were arrested for assault and robbery. Ada was sentenced to 5 years of jail time, and Luther was sentenced to 10 years. Charles was placed in the care of an aunt and uncle in McMeechin, West Virginia. Ada was later placed on parole in 1942, which Charles remembers as the happiest time in his life. A little after her release, Ada and Charles moved to Charleston, West Virginia, where a young Charles constantly played truancy in school, and Ada continued to struggle with alcohol. Ada and Charles later moved to Indianapolis, where Ada met a man named Louis Woodson Cavender Jr. through Alcoholics Anonymous, which she later married in August of 1943. Charles's early life was riddled with criminal offenses and starting to shape into a life of crime. Charles claims to have attempted to set his school on fire at the age of 9, where he was constantly in trouble for skipping and getting caught for small petty thefts. In 1947, at just the age of 13, Charles was sent to Gibalt School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. Gibalt was a school for young delinquent males run by Catholic priests and other similar figures. Gibalt was a very strict school where even the smallest offenses and infractions were met with beatings from a wooden paddle or leather belts. Charles did not stay at Gibalt long, where he eventually fled back home, sleeping under bridges and in the woods. Charles spent the holidays at his home with his mother, but eventually Ada sent Charles back to Gibalt, where he remained for close to a year. But eventually Charles fled Gibalt again, and instead of returning home, Charles fled to the city in 1948, and it was then when Charles committed his first well-documented crime. Charles robbed a grocery store and used the money to rent an apartment and buy food. Charles held a small delivery job for a couple of months, attempting to fly straight, but eventually began committing robberies to supplement his income. He was eventually caught and sentenced to Boys Town, a juvenile correctional facility in Omaha, Nebraska. Not even a week after arriving at Boys Town, Charles met another troubled teen named Blackie Nielsen, where the two managed to get a gun and steal a car. With the car they stole, the pair committed an extra 2 armed robberies on their way to Nielsen's uncle's home in Peoria, Illinois. Nielsen's uncle was a seasoned thief who took the two boys under his wing as apprentice thieves. 2 weeks later, Charles was arrested during a robbery on a store in Peoria. He was convicted of robbery and connected to his 2 earlier robberies en route to Nielsen's uncle, where he was sentenced to spend time at the Indiana Boys School, a strict reform school just outside of Plainfield, Indiana. This is a separate institution from the Boys Town institution mentioned earlier. At the Indiana Boys School, Charles was allegedly taken advantage of sexually by other students. With the support of a staff member, Charles began to develop self-defense techniques to appear insane and attempted to flee the school 18 times. He was eventually successful and escaped with 2 other boys in February of 1951. Charles was only 16 at the time. Charles and the 2 other boys robbed gas stations along their route, their final destination being California. The 3 were arrested in Utah for multiple accounts of theft, where Charles was sent to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. Charles was given a caseworker who deemed him bright based off of aptitude tests, but claimed he was aggressively antisocial and demonstrated psychological issues. In October of 1951, roughly 8 months after being arrested, Charles was transferred to Natural Bridge Honor Camp, a minimum security facility in Virginia. Charles had a parole hearing scheduled for February 1952, but was caught raping a boy at knife point against his will in January, just a month away from his hearing. Upon release of this information, Charles was transferred to another facility named the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. Upon arriving at Federal Reformatory, Charles was convicted of committing multiple homosexual criminal offenses against other residents at least 8 times. Charles was then moved to a maximum security facility in Chillicothe, Ohio, where he was released on good behavior in May 1954. Upon release, he returned to his aunt and uncle's home in West Virginia. Just 7 months later, in January 1955, Charles got married to a woman who worked as a hospital waitress. Her name was Rosalie Jean Willis, nicknamed Rosie. Later that year, in October, Charles and a 3-month pregnant Rosie arrived in Los Angeles with the car that Charles had stolen in Ohio. Charles was charged with the federal crime of taking a stolen vehicle across state lines, but was sentenced to 5 years of probation. Charles remained on parole, but sometime later in March of 1956, Charles was arrested in Indianapolis after stealing a car from Florida and ultimately had his parole revoked and was sentenced to serve 3 years in prison at Terminal Island in Los Angeles. Rosie gave birth to her and Charles's child while he was imprisoned. Charles Manson Jr. was born April 10th, 1956. For a short while, Rosie and Charles's mother would visit Charles while he was in prison, and after about a year later, when Rosie's visits stopped, Charles's mother told him that Rosie had started to live with another man. Charles attempted to escape right before his scheduled parole hearing, and he was put on 5 years probation but had his parole denied. Charles was released on probation in September 1958, divorcing Rosie that same year, but by November, Charles had gotten involved in pimping women in Los Angeles. Some rumors claim that some of the girls were underage and that Charles was holding the girls ransom and receiving money from their wealthy families. About a year later, Charles pleaded guilty to attempting to cash a U.S. Treasury check he had stolen and was also facing charges for prostitution. But a woman he was prostituting named Leona Ray Stevens, nicknamed Candy, testified in favor of Charles and claimed they were madly in love, causing Charles's punishment to only end up being 10 years of his suspense sentence and probation. Charles and Candy did actually end up marrying to sell the lie and to save Charles. Charles, Candy, and another woman went to New Mexico, where Charles planned on prostituting them further. Charles was detained for violating the Mann Act, which is a law that makes it a felony to take a woman or girl across state lines with the purpose of prostitution, debauchery, or any other immoral actions. Charles was quickly released from questioning, but suspected that that was not the end of the situation, and a deeper investigation was coming. Charles skipped town and caused a warrant to be issued for his arrest, and in April 1960, an indictment for violating the Mann Act was issued for Charles. Charles was arrested for a second time in June of 1960 in Laredo, Texas, and sent to Los Angeles for violating his probation and for the US Treasury check fraud, where he was sentenced to serve a 10-year sentence. Charles was serving his sentence at the Los Angeles County Jail, where he spent his time there trying to appeal his case. But a year later, in July 1961, Charles was transferred to the United States Penitentiary at McNeil Island in Washington State. During his time there, Charles took guitar lessons from the leader of the Barker Karpis gang, a man imprisoned for life named Alvin Karpis, nicknamed Creepy. Charles had approached Creepy, asking to be taught guitar lessons so that he could be a famous artist when he is released. Later, in an autobiography by Creepy, Creepy describes Charles as too meek and mild to be a criminal, saying that Charles seemed too lazy to actually make anything of himself as a musician, and that he was well behaved for a person sentenced to 10 years in a federal prison. Creepy was surprised and stated that Charles actually got the hang of guitar pretty quickly. While Charles was at McNeil, Charles actually got the contact information of Phil Kaufman, a producer at Universal Studios. Another noteworthy person Charles met during his time at McNeil was Danny Trejo, who would go on to star in multiple movies and make his own mark in the film industry. The two even attended hypnosis sessions together, hosted by the institution. Charles's mother had also moved to the city of McNeil to be closer to Charles and to visit him. She worked as a waitress nearby. In 1961, Charles was granted a divorce to Candy, who claimed that she had had Charles's son and named him Charles Luther Manson. In June of 1966, Charles was transferred to another facility named Terminal Island in preparation for early release. Charles was released 3 years early, on March 21st, 1967. Charles was 32 at this time and had spent more than half of his life in prisons and reform schools. Charles actually asked for permission to stay imprisoned because he said prison felt like home. Charles's request was denied and he was released. Charles moved to Berkeley in the San Francisco area after his release and was placed under the parole of a man named Roger Smith, who also worked as a doctoral researcher. Smith and another man named David Smith allegedly received funds from the National Institutes of Health and even the CIA to study the effects of LSD and methamphetamine on the counterculture movement in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Charles and the other patients at the medical facility Smith worked at became test subjects for studies, and Charles was granted permission by Smith to move into the Haight-Ashbury district, which was at the heart of the counterculture movement in San Francisco. During his time there, Charles frequently experimented with LSD and began to develop his own philosophy and ideologies. Charles also read a book named Stranger in a Strange Land, a science fiction book written by Robert Heinlein. The events in the book were inspired by the free love philosophy in the Summer of Love in the Haight-Ashbury district. And Charles began to preach his own philosophy based on a mixture of things that inspired him and influenced him, including Stranger in a Strange Land, the Bible, Scientology, Dale Carnegie, and even the Beatles. Charles quickly amassed a loyal following. Charles had met a woman named Mary Brunner, who was 23 at the time and worked as a library assistant at UC Berkeley. The two became romantically involved, where Charles moved in with her and convinced Mary to also take in a teenage runaway named Lynette Fromm. Later nicknamed Squeaky, Charles was able to convince Mary to take in an additional 18 other women who were followers of Charles's philosophy and specifically targeted by Charles for being insecure and outcasts. Thus, the Manson family was born. Charles established himself as a guru and became a hippie icon in the Haight-Ashbury area. Charles taught his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians, and the establishment of government and order were the Romans, which persecuted Christ. Just half a year after his release from prison, Charles, in the late summer of 1967, began to travel with his followers in a modified school bus, replacing seats with colored shag carpet rugs and pillows. The Manson family traveled down the coast, back towards the greater Los Angeles area, and eventually settled mainly in the Topanga Canyon, Malibu, and Venice. Mary was pregnant, and on April 15th, 1968, Mary gave birth to her and Charles' son, named Valentine Michael. Mary gave birth to Valentine in a condemned house in the Topanga Canyon the Manson family was squatting in. Later, in a book named Love Needs Care, written by David Smith, the man who worked closely with Roger Smith, monitoring and studying the effects of LSD on Manson and others, he revealed that Charles's method to recruit followers was to reprogram followers to submit totally to his will through the use of LSD and unconventional sexual practices. Charles aimed to turn his followers into empty vessels that would accept anything he poured. A man named Paul Watkins, who later testified against Charles, claimed that he would encourage group trips and take small amounts himself to stay aware and program everyone else to submit to him. Some core members of the Manson family included Mary Brunner, Charles Watson, nicknamed Tex, Bobby Busole, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. The Manson family stayed in multiple places on their journey, including the home of Dennis Wilson, a band member of the Beach Boys, which he had met earlier in San Francisco. Dennis had an admiration for Charles, nicknaming him the Wizard.
Here are the Beach Boys! Round, year round.
And let him and the Manson family stay for free for a couple of months, using the girls as servants. Charles allegedly recorded a couple of songs independently and with the Beach Boys, but the songs were never released to the public. Dennis eventually sought to distance himself from Charles, claiming that he had gotten into a much heavier drug situation. Dennis began to fear Charles and left the house that he was staying in, which Charles and the Manson family continued squatting in until they were evicted. The Manson family also stayed at Spawn Ranch in August of 1968 after being evicted from Dennis's former home. The ranch got by selling horseback rides and such to the nearby community. Charles had the girls do chores around the ranch and have sex with the 80-year-old man who owned the ranch in exchange to stay there for free. Around this time, Charles also began to promote a doomsday theory to his followers. The theory stated that the black population of the US would rise up to kill the entirety of the white population, but would spare Charles and the Manson family so that he would lead a new black America after a catastrophic civil war. Charles had white supremacy beliefs and adopted the term helter-skelter to refer to the Civil War. The term helter-skelter was taken from a Beatles song off of a Beatles album named The White Album. The following segment may be sensitive for some viewers and contains descriptions of murders done by the Manson family. Crime was no foreign concept to the Manson family. Many crimes were committed during their time by multiple different members and by Charles himself. During the Manson family's time at Spawn Ranch, Tex Watson, a key member of the family, got mixed up with dealing drugs. Tex got into an altercation with a man named Bernard Crow, nicknamed Lots of Papa. Tex ended up robbing Crow because he was a rival drug dealer. Crow threatened to kill everyone in the Manson family residing at Spawn Ranch. Charles heard about the threat and killed Crow himself on July 1st, 1969. Charles suspected Crow of being a member of the Black Panthers and expected his chapter to retaliate. This caused Charles to turn Spawn Ranch into a defensive camp, putting everyone else on edge. Charles even went as far as establishing armed night patrols and sought outside help from a motorcycle gang named Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club. Retaliation never happened since Crow was not a member of the Black Panther Party. Not even a month later, the Manson family was involved with the murder of a man named Gary Allen Hinman, a 34-year-old man who was a music teacher and befriended some of the members of the Manson family previously. Hinman would allow some members to stay at his home in the Topanga Canyon. Charles believed that Hinman was rich and wanted him to join the Manson family and to hand over all of his money and assets to him. So he sent Susan Atkins, Bobby Busole, and Mary Brunner to convince him to join. Things quickly went south, and the three ended up holding Hinman hostage in his own home for 2 days around late July. Allegedly, Charles personally arrived with a sword and slashed Hinman's face and ears. After Charles left, Busole attacked Hinman and stabbed him to death, apparently under Charles's orders. Before leaving the home, the three used Hinman's blood and wrote the words "political piggy" on the wall. They also drew a panther paw, which was a symbol used by the Black Panthers. Apart from murdering an innocent man, they attempted to demonize the Black Panthers in the public eye. Busole was later caught driving Hinman's car, and the police also found the weapon that he used to kill Hinman. Busole was arrested on August 6, 1969.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who
One
starred
of the
in
more
Valley of the
gruesome
Dolls,
and notable crimes was a mass murder at 150 Cielo Drive, the home of Roman Polanski, a movie director who was married to Sharon Tate, a model and actress at the time. On August 9, 1969, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian arrived to the home under Charles's orders to totally destroy the home and everyone in it, and to do it as gruesome as they could. The people who were at the home were Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, Jay Sebring, a friend of Sharon who worked as a celebrity hairstylist, Wojciech Frykowski, and his girlfriend, Abigail Ann Folger, heir to the Folgers coffee fortune, both of whom were friends with Polanski. And the last 2 people on the property were William Garrettson, who worked as a caretaker for the home, and his friend Stephen Earl Parent. The 4 members of the Manson family arrived to the home just past midnight. Watson climbed a telephone pole close to the entrance gate and cut the telephone line. The 4 then climbed the brush, covering the fence, and made their way up the hill towards the house. Suddenly, headlights appeared, and Watson waved to the car to stop. Parent got out and was met by Watson, who pulled out a gun. Parent said that he would not say anything and begged Watson not to hurt him. Watson lunged at Parent and slashed his hands, and then proceeded to shoot Parent 4 times in the chest and torso. Parent was killed and left in the front seat of his car, and he was only 18 at the time. The 4 then continued to make their way up towards the house. Watson told Kasabian to be on lookout, and she stayed back. Watson then cut a window screen and snuck into the home, letting Atkins and Krenwinkel in through the front door. The first person they encountered was Frykowski, who was sleeping on a couch in the living room. Watson began assaulting Frykowski while Atkins and Krenwinkel went and found the other people in the home. They forced them into the living room at knife point. Watson began preparing a rope and tying it around Tate and Sebring's necks, where he planned to throw them over a beam and hang them. Sebring began protesting the violence against a pregnant woman, and Watson just shot and killed him. Watson proceeded to stab Sebring's dead body multiple times. Frykowski had his hands bound with a towel, but got free and was struggling against Atkins, who then stabbed his legs. Frykowski tried to make a run for it, even with his legs being cut and punctured, but Watson caught up to him on the porch and then pistol whipped him and stabbed him repeatedly, shooting him twice. Folger also attempted to run away, but was caught by Krenwinkel, who tackled her on the front lawn and then stabbed her to death. Folger's autopsy stated that she had been stabbed a total of 28 times. Sharon Tate begged and pleaded to be left alive long enough to birth her child. Instead, she was stabbed 16 times, but she didn't die from the stabbing. In Tate's autopsy, it was revealed that she was still alive when she was hung, and ruled her death being both suffocating and massive hemorrhage. Before leaving, Atkins used Tate's blood to write the word pig on the front door to try to clear Busole's name, who had been arrested a couple days ago. The reason for this mass murder order was Charles's history with the previous resident of 150 Cielo Drive, Terry Melcher. Melcher was a music producer who considered giving Charles a music contract, but then decided not to. Charles claimed he wanted to commit a crime that would shock the world, but some believe it was a personal attack, since Charles felt rejected by the music industry. 3 other murders that the Manson family were responsible for were of a middle-aged married couple who were tied up and tortured and killed in their own home by some members of the Manson family. The cause was that Charles was not pleased with the events at 150 Cielo Drive and wanted his followers to experiment using different weapons. The last murder was of a ranch hand at Spawn Ranch who Charles did not like and looked down upon for marrying a black woman, and he believed that he was reporting the crimes to the police. Charles was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder, but the LAPD believes that he should have been convicted of 12 more, but those murders were not connected back to him. Some believe that the number of murders that Charles is responsible for is actually closer to 35.
Charles Manson, 36, chose a house at random, tied up the family at gunpoint, then ordered his followers to go inside and commit ritual slaughter.
Around late August, police were investigating a series of car thefts in the desert near Spawn Ranch. Their investigation actually led them to the Manson family. Charles and others were arrested for trying to evade arrest. Among those was Susan Watkins and Leslie Van Houten. With Charles, Atkins, and Van Houten in custody at the Los Angeles County Jail, it was only a matter of time before the Manson family was completely revealed. Atkins ended up bragging about her involvement in crimes to a cellmate, who later told authorities, further incriminating the Manson family. After months of investigation and tension between teams investigating different murders done by the Manson family separately, arrest warrants were finally issued for Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian on December 1st, 1969. The Manson family quickly scrambled and fell apart after the arrest of Charles, with members being arrested in different parts of the country, including McKinney, Texas, Mobile, Alabama, and even Concord, New Hampshire. After further investigation, police were able to locate lost murder weapons and fingerprints at the scenes of the crimes. The official trial and prosecution for the Manson family began on June 15th, 1970. The first day of testimony was July 24th, 1970. Charles appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead, claiming that it was because he had X'd himself from the establishment's world. Other members of the Manson family followed suit and carved X's into their foreheads as well. He claimed it was an X, but it more closely resembled a swastika. During the trial's progress, other Manson family members would be seen standing outside of the courthouse with X's carved into their foreheads, attempting to intimidate prosecutors and brandishing hunting knives, which they were legally allowed to carry. The trial was riddled with trouble, including Manson family members who were arrested, trying to silence former members willing to testify against the family. Charles flashing the jury, President Richard Nixon making a statement that Manson is guilty, and the media glamorizing Charles. At one point, Charles even leaped over his table and attempted to attack the judge, but was wrestled to the ground. Charles shaved his head about halfway through the penalty phase of the trial and told the media that he was the devil, which did not help his defense. The three women on trial also shaved their heads in support of Charles. The trial dragged on for months, but eventually ended on April 19th, 1971, where Judge Older sentenced the four to death at first, but the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional in 1972, and their sentences were changed to life sentences. During the trial and prosecution, Charles was in custody at the Los Angeles County Jail, but was transferred to Folsom State Prison on April 22nd, 1971, to spend the rest of his life. This would pretty much be the end of Charles committing any crimes, where he would serve his sentence silently and attempt a couple parole hearings, but ultimately be denied. Charles was pretty much well behaved and served his sentence through the 70s. The Manson family pretty much disbanded for the most part. Key members of the Manson family were serving their sentences, and the Manson family was being forgotten until a scandal where Lynette Fromm, nicknamed Squeaky, and once one of the first recruits to the Manson family, which Charles personally recruited when she was a teenage runaway, and was the first woman who moved into Mary Brenner's home. Squeaky and another member named Sandra Good had attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford on September 5th, 1975. Their attempt failed, and an investigation of their apartment revealed that the pair had been threatening corporate and U.S. government officials via paper mail. Squeaky was arrested and became the first person in U.S. history to be sentenced to the United States Code, Title 18, Chapter 84, which made it a federal crime to attempt to assassinate the president. During the 80s, Charles gave a couple interviews to the media, most of which contained footage of Charles and captured just how insane he actually was. It was clear to see that there was something off about him. There was an incident on September 25th, 1984, where another inmate poured paint thinner on Charles and set him on fire. The other inmate was named Jan Holstrom, and he claimed that it was because Charles didn't like his Hare Krishna chants, which the other inmate did for religious reasons. This caused Charles to be put into a protective housing unit, apart from the prison's general population. During his life sentence, Charles was moved around to a couple different facilities, including Folsom State Prison, San Quentin State Prison, Pelican Bay State Prison, and California Medical Facility in Vacaville. The 90s and 2000s were pretty uneventful, and Charles pretty much served his sentence in silence. Now, in more recent times, Charles was becoming very old and began to suffer major health concerns. Charles was rushed to the hospital on January 1st, 2017 for gastrointestinal bleeding and was treated, but doctors claimed that he was too weak to be cured completely, and on November 19th, 2017, Charles Manson died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure, which was brought on by colon cancer. Charles's grandson, a man named Jason Freeman, received what remained of Charles's estate and his body, and he had Charles Manson's body cremated on March 2018. Charles Manson lived an eventful life, riddled with crime and trouble. He went on to make his mark in American history under negative circumstances. Hopefully, the world never sees the rise of a figure like Charles Manson again. Thank you for watching.
You are the king. I love this world. To you I bring. You know, you can be free. Look at your kind.